So, hello and welcome back to Complete World War Two. Okay, this is part 23. Okay, Pacific Theatre 1942. Part 2, okay, carrying on from last part. So on 19th of January, in the Philippines, okay, in Luzon, the Japanese repulsed renewed American counterattacks. Japanese column advancing along the Abu Abu Valley reaches the outskirts of Gitol and is engaged by a Filipino division. Okay, the Pacific Theatre is still in a stage at the moment where there are multiple actions going on in multiple areas. The Japanese have attacked almost everywhere possible. In Malaya, fierce fighting continues in the Muar Yongpeng area. The British lose Yongpeng and face the prospect of annihilation of their forces now cut off at Muar. While in Borneo, British North Borneo, Borneo basically surrenders to the Japanese after the earlier landings I spoke of. Meanwhile, in Burma, the Japanese take Tavoy with its airport. Okay, British decide to withdraw the garrison at Mergui, a town the Japanese have not yet attacked, to Rangoon. A Chinese division is also sent to Burma to reinforce the British positions there against the increasing Japanese attacks. Now, in the Philippines, the Japanese are able to contain counterattacks by Filipino divisions on the left flank of the American Second Corps. After fierce fighting in front of Gitol, they withdraw northwards, but they do continue their pressure on the American First Corps sector. While in Malaya, the British counterattack west of Yongpeng, but suffer no success whatsoever. The forces cut off in the Muar area try to break out, but are checked, and situations looking very grave. 27 Japanese bombers, meanwhile, attack Singapore, but they don't send any Zero fighters with them or any air support whatsoever, and thus the British planes shoot down 9 of those 27 bombers. While over the Bismarck archipelago, that word always confuses me, over 100 Japanese carrier-borne aircraft attack Rabaul in New Britain, causing serious damage to airport installations, and a minor attack is also carried out at Kavieng in New Ireland. While in Burma, the Japanese relentless onslaught continues. Forces from Thailand penetrate actually into Burma. They carry out attacks in region of North Tenasserim, east of Molmine, held by Indian forces. In the Philippines, meanwhile, the fighting continues, in Luzon. The Japanese concentrate their forces for a massive offensive, against the American and Filipino forces. While in Malaya, the British withdrawal from Muar and Segamat continues. The troops in the Muar sector still cut off, have to be supplied by air. New daylight air raids on Singapore are carried out by the Japanese, which are becoming quite constant at the moment. And this time, bombers are escorted by Zero fighters, which compared to the Hurricanes are more than a match. As a number of these Hurricanes have actually been supplied from North Africa and therefore still have the sand removal filtration systems on them, which reduces their speed to a certain point, so they are kind of more an easy target for the Mitsubishi Zeros, and they do lose their radar stations in the area. Now, basically, the earlier enemy action almost eliminated Advance 1 attack, and the British Buffalo fighters need nearly an hour to climb up to 25,000 feet, the height at which the enemy bombers operate. So basically, by the time, due to the damage of previous attacks, by the time the British can get their older fighters up to kind of attack level, the bombers are already in bombing before the planes are pretty much taking off. In Bismarck Archipelago, Japanese resume air raids on Rabaul in New Britain and Kavieng in New Ireland in preparation for invasion there. The only coastal battery in Rabaul is silenced. In New Guinea, Japanese aircraft now open an air offensive in sector, sending 50 aircraft to attack the Leh Salamaua area. In China, meanwhile, General Stilwell, is nominated as Chiang Kai-shek's Chief of Staff of forces operating in China, of course. While in Luzon, General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, orders all American and Filipino forces to withdraw from the Mauban Abake line to the Bataan Peninsula's final defense behind the Pillar Bagak Road. Withdrawal is carried out in 3 days. Meanwhile, Japanese attacks are held off. Now, during the night of 22nd and 23rd of January, the invaders begin a series of amphibious operations operations carrying troops southwards from Moron to Kai Bobo, south of Bagek. Okay, 2 Japanese lighters are sunk by US motor torpedo boats. Now in Malaya, the battle on the Muar front ends in complete victory for Japanese despite support from air and sea. The Indian division defending it is wiped out. The forces defending Batu Pahat, which are units of some Indian divisions, have some skirmishes with enemy. On east coast at Peninsula, a Japanese attempt to break through at Mersing is repulsed and held off. More Indian troops, meanwhile, begin to arrive in Singapore. 100 Japanese bombers attack Singapore, causing many deaths and causing also immense damage. Now, meanwhile, in the Batam Peninsula, okay, Japanese pressure is intensifying due to them kind of collating their forces for a large attack. Now, the navigational errors, okay, during the Japanese amphibious landings that they are carrying out, embarked at Moronfa Port, Kai Bobo, are partly landed near Point Quinian, okay, and partly at Point further down the coast, both a long way south of their objective. Now, American and Filipino troops are sent to repel the invaders, but are unsuccessful. While in Malaya, fighting continues in area of Batu Pahat. The troops defending the Segamat and Muar front succeed in breaking off the fight and retiring southwards. So everywhere they are managing to put resistance against the Japanese, but they are ultimately failing. The defence of Johor State, which means the defence of the Singapore base, is mainly in ANZA Indian 3rd Corps. While in the Bismarck Archipelago, okay, more Japanese troops in convoys escorted by the Japanese 4th Fleet land at Rabaul in New Britain and Kavieng in New Ireland as predicted. The tiny garrison at Rabaul, an important base area, is quickly overcome, while Kavieng is virtually undefended, so easy wins there for the Japanese. While in the Solomon Islands, elements of the Japanese 4th Fleet invade Kieta, meeting no opposition. While in the Dutch East Indies, 2 Japanese convoys land troops in Borneo and Celebes. Okay, Dutch aircraft attack the Japanese ships, but suffer little success. While in Burma, Japanese air activity is also intensifying in the Rangoon area, with the objective of wiping out the British Air Force in that area to make it easier for the Japanese Air Force to support land operations. So basically, okay, in the Strait of Makassar, okay, the first big naval battle since beginning of operations in Pacific Theatre takes place between Borneo and Celebes. Now, 16 Japanese naval transports under escort of 1 light cruiser and 9 destroyers are attacked, okay, by a bunch of American destroyers, including the Parrot, the Pope, the John D. Ford, and the Paul Jones, and a group of submarines. Now, 4 of the Japanese transports and 1 of the escort vessels are sunk by the American ships. 1 American destroyer is damaged. Now, this action holds up the invasion of Java for a number of days, but not the occupation of the oil port, which is captured on the same day. So the Americans do have a great success there, but do not succeed in stopping the oil port in the neighbouring district from falling. Meanwhile, in Batam Peninsula, the American 2nd Corps defending eastern sector retires rapidly southwards, and the situation is no better in western sector, where troops at 1st Corps only temporarily succeed in driving back the Japanese troops, which have performed an amphibious landing, which is south of the whole American line. So Japanese troops have now landed behind the main American line. While in Malaya, plans are made to withdraw all British forces to island of Singapore. Now, hard fighting is continuing at Batu Pahat, and the Japanese threaten the town of Kluang. About 3,000 Australian troops, okay, still not fully trained, arrive in Singapore as reinforcements. So both the Australians and the Indians are landing troops in Singapore ready for an all-out defence. While in New Guinea, Allied troops evacuate Lae, the capital, and Salamaua, directly threatened by the Japanese. Now, Burma, okay, the Japanese are approaching the town of Mulmine, so they are closing, distance on some more major areas in the vicinities. That they are fighting in. So in New Guinea, okay, the Japanese finally land at Lae. And in the Philippines, on Luzon, retirement of the American and Filipino troops in the southern sector of the Batam Peninsula continues. The defenders cannot manage to wipe out the enemy detachments at 2 major ports the Japanese have landed at. While in Malaya, fighting at Batu Pahat goes on all day, but it's now clear that the Japanese victory is absolutely going to come at some point. It's just a question of when. Now, on East at Peninsula, however, the enemy attacks in the Kluang area are forcibly repulsed, so a little bit of success in the ongoing Japanese victories. Now in Burma, General Wavell visits Rangoon and orders that Mulmine must be defended at all costs. So all the troops of an Indian division are deployed on West Bank at River Salween in the defence of Mulmine. The Japanese engaged in regrouping. They do not launch any further substantial operations. And meanwhile, Thailand, declares war on the United States and Great Britain, and Australia now orders full military mobilisation ready for ongoing war with the Japanese. Now, meanwhile, in Philippines, the Americans and Filipinos complete the withdrawal to the southern tip at Bataan Peninsula behind the line of the Pilar Bagak Road. Now, gaps are opened between several major units, hastily plugged with reserve troops, but they are nearing the end of their tether. At the extreme south at Peninsula, the Japanese maintain their bridgeheads at various points. They have won with their amphibious landings, and the Americans, fearing more landings, start to send extra defences to key coastal ports and towns. In Malaya, a Japanese amphibious unit lands at Endau on east side of Peninsula and quickly moves inland. Now, British forces in the Batu Pahat area, already outflanked by Japanese, try and regain their lines by filtering and escaping through the jungle. So basically the war in the Pacific is raging on. The Japanese are everywhere. In Philippines, the Japanese make a new landing at Port Anyasan, which is just north of a prior bridgehead they've secured. Now, after consolidating the bridgeheads in those two sectors, Japanese are ordered to advance on the town of Mariveles, extreme south of the Bataan Peninsula. The Japanese are just attacking absolutely everywhere now, but the Americans and Filipinos hold out along the line, the last defensive line that they have set up. While in Malaya, commander of Allied troops in Malaya, General Percival, gets permission from General Wavell to withdraw his forces onto the island of Singapore when a suitable opportunity is offered. He decides that they'll move by way of Johor Bahru, and the causeway linking it with Singapore, and that the movement must be completed during night of 30th and 31st of January. Defending troops are already fighting rearguard actions. Some are being taken off by sea. But already they're trying to formulate the defence of Singapore, but already Singapore area is coming under intense pressure. Now in the Bataan Peninsula, the fierce fighting continues. The American and Filipino troops continue to harass the Japanese bridgeheads. They won with their amphibious landings, but they gain no outward success. Now the retreat of the British forces in Malaya from mainland continues. The Japanese reach Benut in pursuit of an Indian division which retreats in complete disorder, leaving the 22nd Indian Brigade uncovered on its flank and completely cut off from the main body of troops. While in New Guinea, the Japanese land on Russell Island, east of New Guinea. Now the threat to Australia is becoming increasingly grave. So basically in Pacific now, the Chief of Staff's Committee sets up the ANZAC, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. Command of naval operations in South Pacific is given over to the Americans, but 29th of January 1942, the ANZAC Theatre of Operations is officially set up. In Fiji, American troops arrived to garrison the island, potentially anticipating a Japanese attack there. Now in the Philippines, Americans and Filipinos hold out against the growing enemy pressure in the Bataan Peninsula, and after heavy artillery preparation, they succeed in wiping out the Japanese bridgehead, won on the first amphibious landing. In Malaya, the British withdrawal to Singapore continues. Units at British 18th Division arrive on the island with about 10 light tanks, the only armour that has ever been sent to Malaya. While in the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese land at Bandoeng and in Mampuan, in the Celebes and in Dutch Borneo, and occupy a number of coastal towns. The Japanese are really on the ascendancy. In the Philippines, in southern part of Bataan Peninsula, the Japanese put pressure on American-Filipino defensive lines and establish a bridgehead across the River Pillar. The defenders try in vain to eliminate the bridgehead, as well as that at Point Quinian. Now in Singapore, the 22nd Indian Brigade is still cut off, left by the withdrawal of other Indian units. It's cut off by the enemy advance, and some of their units have to be taken to Singapore by sea. It's decided to transfer all Air Force units to Dutch East Indies, except for one fighter squadron, so great is danger from enemy air attack. And as the Japanese close the pincers around Singapore and in Malaya, that air threat becomes even greater. In the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese take Amboina between Celebes and New Guinea, which is one of the biggest naval bases in that entire area, and of course thus a good strategic port for the Japanese. The Dutch and Australian garrison is quickly overwhelmed. While in Burma, the Japanese open a powerful onslaught on Mulmine and managed to capture the airport. So this war rages on, the final day of January 1942, Japanese attacks are driven off by intensive artillery fire in the Philippines. The Japanese units that have infiltrated behind the main American lines are still cut off from supplies, and during the night they do begin to evacuate the bridgehead across the River Pillar. The Japanese command sends reinforcements to their other bridgehead in the area. Now in Malaya at 8:15 a.m. the last British units withdraw from Malayan mainland to the island of Singapore. Now the 3/4 mile causeway connecting the island of Singapore with mainland is blown up, and the siege of Singapore begins. Now Lieutenant General Percival actually issues a statement saying the Battle of Malaya has come to an end and the Battle of Singapore is about to begin. Now the island is divided into 3 defensive sectors, north, south and west, under the command of individual commanders, and they are now ready for the Japanese onslaught. Now in Burma, the garrison at Mulmine withdraws across the river Salween. The Japanese bomb and shell Martaban, and a brigade of the 19th Indian Division reaches Rangoon, as reinforcements are still flooding in all the time. Now in the Pacific on February 1st, American Navy task forces under Vice Admiral Halsey and Rear Admiral Fletcher, consisting of 2 aircraft carriers, 5 cruisers and 10 destroyers, launched surprise attacks on Japanese air bases at Wallerline, Wachi, Roy, Mille and the Marshall Islands, and Makin in the Gilbert Islands. Now airport installations are severely damaged by bombs and shellfire. During the action, the American aircraft carrier Enterprise and the cruiser Chester are damaged. The Enterprise, rather ominously by a suicide bomber, which of course with the kamikazes will become a tactic the Japanese turn to more and more as the war goes on. Now in the Philippines, an attempted landing by Japanese in south of the Bataan Peninsula is driven off by American motor torpedo boats, and a part of Japanese force which should have gone to one of their earlier bridgeheads manages to make a landing in the area of Anyasan. Now no activity of importance takes place on rest up front, as the various forces, Japanese, American and Filipino, seem to take a little bit of a breather in the area after already a few months of fierce fighting. So on February 2nd, in Bataan Peninsula, American and Filipino forces jump back into action and attack the Japanese bridgehead across the River Pillar. Now during the night, the Japanese retire across the river. However, the Americans can still not destroy the other bridgehead in the area, although they do make some progress in the Anyasan sector. And the American and Filipino forces retake the bridgehead over the River Pillar, evacuated by the Japanese the previous night. In the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese begin air attacks that herald the invasion of Java. Now their bombers, taking off from Kendari in Celebes, hit bases at Surabaya, Madianon and Malang, severely damaging port installations and destroying on the ground all remaining Dutch aircraft in Java. The attack comes out of the blue and the Japanese have complete success and wipe out the Dutch Air Force in the area. Now in New Guinea, the Japanese begin the bombardment of Port Moresby, capital of Papua, where there's a small Australian garrison. And Chiang Kai-shek sends the Japanese 5th Army and the remainder of the 6th Army to reinforce the British forces in Burma. So the Chinese, who have been fighting the Japanese for years, are now also sending forces to Burma to help the British out there. Now, the Japanese in Singapore demand unconditional surrender of the Imperial forces. When this is refused, 4 days of intense bombardment of Singapore continue. And in Borneo, a Dutch and American naval squadron with 4 cruisers and 7 destroyers, commanded by Rear Admiral Dorman, passes through the Strait of Madura to attack the Japanese forces landing, but is spotted and attacked from the air. Now, the mission has to be abandoned. The heavy cruiser Houston and the light cruiser Marblehead, both American, are seriously damaged. Now, in Amboina, a small garrison trying to oppose Japanese landing is forced to surrender. Also in Borneo. Now in the Philippines, the defenders of Bataan succeed in driving Japanese who have landed at Port Quinanayan back to beaches. Limited activity on rest at front. In Singapore, a convoy lands the remainder at British 18th Division and further Indian reinforcements on island. Now the slowest ship in the convoy, the Empress of Asia, is sunk by Japanese aircraft with considerable loss of life, and violent air raids take place on the port warehouses on Singapore. The US, meanwhile, replies to Thailand's declaration of war by declaring war back on Thailand. Now, in the Philippines, Japanese reinforcements land in Gulf of Lingayen on Luzon. The Japanese begin shelling fortifications of the islands in the Gulf of Manila. In the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese take Samarinda on the east coast of Borneo. So, in Singapore, General Percival, commanding Singapore, declares the city will resist to the last man. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, in Bataan Peninsula, the Americans attack 2 salients established by Japanese in central sector and continue mopping up a bridgehead over a river. Basically, what is happening here, the American and Filipino forces in Philippines are really putting up absolutely stiff resistance. The Japanese are launching amphibious assaults, frontal assaults, winning bridgeheads. The American and Filipino forces are counter-attacking. Really, this campaign in the Philippines, Luzon, Bataan, is really goes underrated. The American and Filipino forces really cover themselves with a lot of pride in this fight against the Japanese. Japanese forces trying to land in area are driven off by artillery fire. So in Singapore, 8:45 p.m. on February 8th, a powerful artillery preparation. The Japanese, units at 4th, 5th and 18th Divisions land on north coast of the island. Now, despite tenacious British resistance, they established a small bridgehead and advanced towards Tengah Airfield, which is the biggest airfield on Singapore. Meanwhile, in Philippines, General Homer, commander at Japanese forces on Luzon, orders a general withdrawal to new positions. See, the Americans and Filipinos are absorbing attacks and then successfully pushing the Japanese back in their defiant resistance in the Philippines. The Americans tried to cut off the 2 enemy salients and complete the annihilation at various bridgeheads, but do not succeed in doing so, while in New Britain the Japanese take Gasmata. So the war rages on. The Philippine theatre is a major theatre, and like I said back in the Pearl Harbor part, the Philippines erupts everywhere. The Japanese have been preparing their attack plans in Philippines for a long time, and they just go on the offensive everywhere. Now, in the Bataan Peninsula, Filipinos and American forces continue attacks on the new Japanese assailants, and Japanese suicide squads make repeated forays. So basically, these are Japanese troops who go out to kill themselves but kill enemies with them. Now, fierce fighting rages in Singapore. Now, General Percival sends reinforcements but to the areas where fighting is happening, but the Japanese do succeed in reaching Tengah Airfield. 15,000 Japanese who have crossed in lighters and rubber boats over arm at sea separating Malaya from the island of Singapore occupy the western part of Singapore. And in the Philippines, the defenders continue their activity against the larger of the Japanese assailants on Bataan Peninsula in the area of Anyasan. Strong pressure is put on the Japanese. In Singapore, the British withdraw from western part of the island, running to a stronger defence line, running from Kranji to Jurong. They do counterattack but have zero effect on the attacking Japanese forces. And in the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese continue occupation of Borneo Borneo, and Celebes, where they land in force at Makassar. In Burma, the Indian troops defending the River Salween near Martaban give way under Japanese pressure, abandon the town, and carry out a fighting withdrawal to Taton. Now, in the Philippines and Bataan Peninsula, Americans make further progress against the larger two Japanese assailants, but the Japanese escape encirclement and retire to the north. So, Japanese are actively being pushed back on multiple occasions, losing bridgeheads. The Americans and Filipinos put in the fight of their lives. Now in Singapore, the Japanese advance further. Now General Tomoyuki Yamashita has leaflets dropped on city giving terms for surrender, but the British ignore them. The call has already been put out that Singapore will be defended to the last man. Now in Burma, the Japanese, following their last success after ferocious attacks, advance across the river Salween. Now in Singapore, the Japanese repeatedly and forcefully attacking. Evening, the British withdraw the gun crews from coast defence batteries on East and South East Island to reinforce the defensive perimeter around the city of Singapore itself. Now the defenders are becoming critically short of reinforcements. They are already getting worn down by the consistent Japanese attacks and the ferocity of the Japanese offensive. Now in Philippines, in Bataan Peninsula, the Americans have eliminated a large Japanese salient and now attack the smaller salient. In southern sector, a Japanese landing in the area of Silaim near Anyasan is also effectively wiped out. In Singapore, the British defensive perimeter has to contract under incessant Japanese pressure. Now during evening, all ships leave the harbour of Singapore. The 15-inch coastal defence guns, which were there to apparently make the island impregnable, are destroyed without a single shot being fired. And in the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese occupy Bandajar and Masin, a key point in southeastern Borneo. It also, in February 1942, in Bataan Peninsula, the Filipinos and Americans reduce the Japanese salient further, the last salient they are working on, while in Singapore the Japanese continue their ferocious attack, mainly in western sector of the island of Singapore, but supplies of water, food and ammunition are rapidly becoming exhausted in Singapore, and they do not have much resistance left. In the Dutch East Indies, Japanese parachutists land at Palembang in Sumatra. The small Dutch garrison is forced to retire. An Allied task force tries to engage the enemy ships in the Bangkok Strait, but is heavily attacked by Japanese aircraft and has to withdraw. And on February 15th, Singapore officially falls after a ferocious Japanese landing and incessant attacks. General Percival signs the document surrendering the city and garrison to General Tomoyuki Yamashita. The surrender is unconditional and takes effect immediately. The Japanese take 70,000 prisoners of war, including British, Indian and Australian troops, and the capture of the rich Malayan Peninsula, is a major coup for the Japanese, a major victory for them. The fortress, described as Gibraltar in the east, has cost the Japanese 10,000 dead, wounded and missing. So basically, Malaya and Singapore have fallen. The Japanese have lost a lot of lives, but the rich resources in that area, the ports, the airfields, it is also a major success for that bloodshed. Now in the Dutch East Indies, following up the parachutists, a Japanese invasion fleet arise off Palembang in Sumatra and land substantial reinforcements in spite of renewed air attacks by British aircraft. Now the Allies have to withdraw before completing the demolition of the oil refinery, so it is wide open for the Japanese to take. Now an Allied convoy sails from Darwin, in northern Australia, with reinforcements for Kupang on the island of Timor. Objective of mission is to occupy Penfoy airfield, the only airfield on Timor which aircraft can be used for operations against the Japanese in Java. Meanwhile in Burma, Indian troops abandon Taton and begin to withdraw behind the river Bilin, pursued by the oncoming Japanese. In the Dutch East Indies, British aircraft and aircrews leave Sumatra and cross to Java. The Allied convoy making for Timor has to change course on account of heavy Japanese air attacks. While meanwhile, Seabees, the Americans land a battalion of Seabees at Border Society Islands to build and equip an airfield. In the Philippines, situation unchanged in Bataan Peninsula, where the Japanese continue to withdraw to more favourable conditions. So really everywhere is falling back, except for the stubborn and continual defence of the Bataan Peninsula. So the Japanese invade island of Bali east of Java. Okay, the British and Dutch destroy bridges and military installations. A naval engagement begins in the evening and lasts until next day between the escort vessels of the Japanese convoy carrying infantry through Strait of Lombok and an allied squadron under Dutch Rear Admiral Dorman. A Dutch cruiser and one American destroyer are damaged. The Japanese have only lost, one destroyer from the fleet being damaged. In Burma, the Japanese crossed the river Bilin near Bilin and attacked the 17th Indian Division on the flank, forcing it to retire, and Mandalay is now bombed. In the Philippines, in Bay of Manila, Japanese guns pound the fortified islands of Luzon, including Corregidor. A United States submarine embarks President Quezon of the Philippines to escort him out of the area. In the East Indies, the Japanese land on Portuguese Timor, which for the past month has held a small allied garrison. Australia is now directly threatened by the airfield on there. And in Burma, evacuation of Rangoon civilian population is ordered within the next 48 hours. So basically, an American task force consisting of aircraft carrier Lexington with cruisers and destroyers sails for Rabaul, New Britain, to eject the Japanese, but has to turn back in face of extremely heavy air attacks. Now, Japanese sacrificed many of their aircraft in repulsing this threat and have to postpone their proposed action against New Guinea. So, although forcing an American withdrawal, it also forces Japanese to slow down their plans on New Guinea. Meanwhile, in Burma, the 17th Indian Division retires, on Mok Palin, pursued by the Japanese. And in the Philippines, the Japanese consolidate their defensive positions, withdrawing the troops still in forward positions in the area of Balanga. Now, in Burma, the Japanese launch a fierce attack against units of 17th Indian Division in the area of Mok Palin, where a bridge over the river Sitang is essential for the passage of troops. Now, President Roosevelt orders General MacArthur to leave the Philippines and transfer his headquarters back to Washington. Now, in Bismarck Archipelago, 6 American B-17 bombers and the Flying Fortresses take off from an Australian base and bomb Rabaul in New Britain for the first time. In Dutch East Indies, the Japanese war communique announces the island of Amboina is now entirely in Japanese hands. Allied headquarters staff leave Java, which is already in severe danger, for more safety at Australia. While in Burma, fierce fighting around Japanese bridge over River Sitang continues. The Indians blow up the only bridge in the area, although many of their own units are still on the other side of the river. So that is a case of, well, we must destroy the bridge irrespective of our troops on the other side, or the Japanese will capture it, and then they could be in trouble. So basically, we're at a point where Singapore and Malaya has fallen. Burma is coming under intense pressure. In Borneo, Celebes, New Guinea, the Japanese offensive goes on everywhere. Still fighting in the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. Now, at Wake Island, an American task force commanded by Vice Admiral Halsey, consisting of aircraft carrier Enterprise, 2 cruisers, 7 destroyers, shells and bombs Japanese installations on the island of Wake, while the evacuation of Java continues. Now, in Dutch East Indies, Unified Allied ABDA command is broken up. General Wavell leaves Java, and only the Dutch forces remain to defend it. In Burma, Japanese infiltrate through a gap, in the lines in Burma, threatening the Rangoon Mandalay Railway. While in the Philippines, Japanese amphibious forces leave Olongapo, on the island of Luzon, for the island of Mindoro. And in the Indian Ocean, the American flying boat ship Langley, on way to Java, is sunk by Japanese aircraft, and sunk with 32 aircraft on board. In Burma, violent fighting has now broke out between two sides in the area of Wa, northeast of Pegu. Infiltration of Japanese west at Sitang River continues, but the fighting is heating up there. Now, in the Java Sea, a big naval battle which ends in a Japanese victory near Surabaya. An Allied task force commanded by Rear Admiral Carol Dorman, consisting of 5 cruisers and 11 destroyers, takes on the Japanese ships escorting the convoy carrying troops for invasion of Java. Now, 2 Dutch cruisers, the Java and the De Ruyter, are sunk, and 2 British and 1 Dutch destroyers are also sunk. 1 British and 1 American cruisers are damaged. Virtually the whole squadron is put out of action. The Japanese suffer some damage, but not enough to stop their invasion plans. In Philippines, the Japanese, who sailed from Luzon, land on northwest of Mindoro and capture an airfield. The island is now almost totally undefended, and the invaders have an easy task. Now, in Java, Japanese invasion force lands, after great victory at sea. Japanese troops drawn from 16th Army are able to disembark without interference, and now the route to the Sunda Islands lies open to them. The 4 American destroyers that escaped from the battle at Java Sea set course for the Sunda Strait, while in Burma, British troops fall back on Pegu, the prelude to general retirement. So this attack has been vicious and ongoing. In Dutch East Indies, having almost eliminated Allied fleet in the area and destroyed virtually all Dutch and British aircraft on ground, Japanese are able to occupy Java with incredible speed. All Allied ships in island harbours leave to take refuge in Australia, but in the Sunda Strait, these ships were the remainder of Admiral Dorman's squadron and met by superior Japanese forces. The cruisers Houston, from the US, and Perth, an Australian cruiser, and 2 American destroyers and 1 tanker are sunk. So Allied naval losses in the Java area have been quite intense. 1 British and 1 Dutch destroyer are also lost. The Japanese lose only 4 transports. So incredible fighting. In Burma, Japanese continue to infiltrate between 1st Burma Division and the 17th Indian Division. Bypassing Pegu, they now converge on Rangoon. And in the Dutch East Indies, Japanese continue their occupation of Java. The communiques sent from the Japanese announced the capture of the capital, Batavia, which the government at Dutch East Indies has left to move to Bandoeng. Now, in New Guinea, Japanese aircraft begin massive air raids in preparation for invasion, and also on the 2nd of March 1942, Australia declares war on Thailand. Following Thailand's earlier declaration of war against America and its allies, America declared war. Now Australia also declares war on Thailand. Fierce fighting continues in Burma, while in the Philippines, a Japanese contingent lands at Zamboanga in the island of Mindanao. Now, Japanese aircraft, raid Broome in Western Australia, where most of refugees from Java are concentrated. Many Allied aircraft are destroyed on the ground. This is as a result of many of the advanced in area air bases and airfields the Japanese have captured that allow them to attack further south and have a larger sphere of influence for their aircraft. So basically, in early March, MacArthur reorganises forces defending islands in readiness of his departure from the Philippines. Now, General Sharp retains command of the Mindanao garrison, while General from the Philippines takes command of the forces in the central sector. Troops on Corregidor and the other fortified islands in Bay of Manila will come under command of General Moore, while those on Luzon will be regrouped under a further general. Now, in Dutch East Indies, the battle to defend Java is now totally lost, and the Dutch destroy all installations that can be of value to the Japanese. Now, in China, General Stilwell, who's been appointed head of American forces in China, sets up headquarters in Chongqing, the headquarters of the new American forces operating in China, Burma, and India. While, in Dutch East Indies, fierce fighting continues in Java, but the Dutch announced the evacuation of Batavia, the secondary capital that's set up. In New Britain, a Japanese convoy sails from Rabaul in direction of the Gulf of Huon in New Guinea, carrying invasion troops. While in Burma, General Alexander arrives in Rangoon, and takes over command of troops in Burma. He orders an immediate counter-offensive to close the gap between the 1st Burmese and the 17th Indian Division. The Japanese attack Pegu from the west and succeed in entering the town. While in the Dutch East Indies, Java, falls finally to the Japanese. All Allied fighter aircraft have been destroyed. Radio communications with Bandueng are cut off. The Dutch government administrators have already fled to Australia, and the garrisons under the command of General Porten officially surrender to the Japanese. And in Burma, Rangoon is evacuated. The British retire to north of the country and from now on have to be supplied by the air. Now the Pegu garrison, still cut off, is ordered to break out and make its way north to join up with them. While in New Guinea, during night of 7th of March, the Japanese invasion convoy arrives in the Gulf of Fuon, and under cover of fire from escort vessels lands the first contingents of troops at Salamaua and Lai, meeting no opposition. While in Burma, the Japanese finally enter Rangoon following a massive assault into Burma. Indian infantry with tank and artillery support break through Japanese block on the Rangoon Prom Road, along which now the British are retiring. So the Japanese have made enormous headway. They have had enormous successes. The war in the Pacific will rage on. Of course, we have major events coming up in further editions, like the Battle of Coral Sea, and of course a battle talked of as one of the great turning points in the Pacific. Of course, I am talking about the Battle of Midway, to come in further editions, as well as updating you on further Pacific action in 1942 coming up in part 3. I'm out for now.